December 7, 1941. Dawn creeps over the still waters of Pearl Harbor like a thief in the dark. The sky is streaked in soft gold, the air humid with the quiet rhythm of a Sunday morning. Sailors aboard the U.S. battleships are waking slowly, half-dressed, clutching tin cups of coffee. Across the Pacific, 230 miles to the north, another fleet cuts through the mist with deadly precision. On the deck of the Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fukuda peers through his binoculars and whispers the word that will shatter the calm. Tora! 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 The radio crackles, and within seconds, a swarm of aircraft descends toward Hawaii, their engines screaming like banshees. The explosions that follow tear through the morning silence, hurling columns of smoke into the sky. The Arizona bursts into flame, sailors dive into burning oil slicks, and the ground trembles beneath the concussions. It is a scene of horror and awe, the kind of moment that carves itself into history with fire. But amid the chaos, something strange catches the attention of the Japanese pilots. The harbor is filled with battleships, destroyers, and cruisers, but not one of America's prized aircraft carriers is there. The Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, the floating airfields that represent America's new naval philosophy, are all gone, out to sea by sheer chance. The Japanese had hoped to strike a death blow. Instead, they have awakened a sleeping giant whose monsters are still at large. In Tokyo, news of the victory brings celebration. Radio announcers speak with pride about the divine winds that have humbled the Americans. The Imperial Navy believes it has secured dominance of the Pacific. Yet even as the empire rejoices, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stands apart, silent. A gambler at heart and a realist by training, Yamamoto knows the truth too well. "I fear," he murmurs to a colleague, "all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." His voice carries no arrogance, only quiet dread. Yamamoto understands that the war Japan has just begun cannot be won with one brilliant strike. He knows that the United States has the resources of a continent, steel, oil, factories, and an industrial will that Japan cannot match. Across the ocean, America is reeling. President Franklin D. Roosevelt listens to the casualty reports with clenched fists, then dictates the words that will echo through time. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. But beneath the outrage and grief, something else begins to stir, a hard, determined focus. For all the damage inflicted at Pearl Harbor, America's most flexible and powerful tools of war, the aircraft carriers, have survived untouched. In a strange twist of fate, Japan has spared the very weapons that will one day destroy its own fleet. The aircraft carrier, before that morning, was not the centerpiece of naval power. Admirals on both sides still worshipped the battleship, the great iron monsters whose guns could hurl shells the weight of cars across miles of ocean. The carrier was seen as a support ship, a floating base for reconnaissance planes or small bombing raids. Many in Japan's Imperial Navy considered them fragile, even dishonorable. Real warriors fought with guns, not aircraft launched from wooden decks. Yet, in America, a handful of visionaries were already whispering that the future belonged to the sky. Men like Admiral William Bull Halsey and Commander Mark Mitcher had spent years studying how planes could project power far beyond the horizon. When the war began, they were ready to prove it. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy's carriers became ghosts, vanishing into the vastness of the Pacific. They moved silently, striking fast and disappearing again before Japan could react. The Japanese, proud of their own naval air arm, had not imagined their enemy could adapt so quickly. They had trained for a single decisive battle between great fleets, one moment of glory that would determine the fate of empires. But America was learning a different art of war: mobility, persistence, and endless replacement. For every ship lost, another would rise. For every pilot killed, 3 more were in training. On board the Enterprise, sailors worked around the clock. They ate hurried meals, slept in shifts, and painted slogans on their planes. Remember Pearl Harbor. A young pilot named George Gay, barely 25, wrote to his parents that he no longer felt fear, only anticipation. "We've got a score to settle," he wrote. "They think they've beaten us. They haven't seen what's coming." His words captured a mood that swept through every ship and base from San Diego to Midway, a grim patience. America was preparing its counterpunch. In Tokyo, Yamamoto pushed his staff for intelligence. Where were the American carriers? Why had none been destroyed at Pearl Harbor? The reports that trickled in were incomplete and confusing. The Enterprise had been sighted near Wake Island, then vanished. The Lexington was rumored to be heading for the Coral Sea. The Saratoga had been damaged by a torpedo but would soon return to action. The uncertainty gnawed at him. Japan had the advantage for now, but Yamamoto knew how quickly the tide could turn. His entire career had been shaped by studying America. Its industry, its psychology, its unpredictable resilience. He once told a friend that fighting the United States was like fighting the ocean itself. You may strike it, but it always returns. Meanwhile, Japanese propaganda celebrated the might of its super battleships, Yamato and Musashi. These leviathans were larger and more heavily armed than anything afloat. Their armor was thicker than a man's height. Their guns could hit targets 20 miles away. To the Japanese public, they were symbols of divine power, the steel embodiment of Bushido. Yet the irony was cruel. These ships, built to dominate the sea, would soon find themselves helpless against enemies they could not even see. By February 1942, the ocean had become a chessboard of shadows. American codebreakers began to intercept Japanese messages, and carriers launched small but symbolic raids on enemy positions. On April 18, the Doolittle raid struck Tokyo itself. 16 B-25 bombers launched from the deck of the carrier Hornet. The raid caused minimal damage, but its psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, Japanese civilians saw American bombs fall on their capital. The nation that had been told it was untouchable realized the war was not so distant after all. In the aftermath, Japanese commanders began referring to the American carriers with a mix of anger and awe. Kikaijima no Kaibutsu, one officer wrote, "Monsters of the Machine Island." The phrase would evolve, whispered among pilots and sailors, into something darker, the floating monsters. They were everywhere and nowhere at once, appearing out of clouds, launching planes that rained destruction, then vanishing beyond the horizon before Japan could strike back. The carriers became mythic in proportion, as if America had found a way to turn the ocean itself into a weapon. Within the Japanese high command, debates grew heated. Admiral Nagumo, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, argued for caution. He had seen what carrier-based planes could do, but also how fragile the ships could be. Yamamoto disagreed. He believed Japan must lure the American carriers into battle and destroy them before they multiplied. He devised a plan, a trap to end their reign before it began. That plan would be called Midway. But that moment still lay months ahead. For now, the Pacific remained a place of eerie quiet punctuated by sudden fury. The Americans tested their tactics, learning to coordinate squadrons of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. The Japanese expanded their conquests, sweeping through the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. To many observers, it appeared Japan was unstoppable. But beneath the surface, the foundation of its power was beginning to crack. The empire's supply lines stretched thin, its pilots were irreplaceable, and its factories could not match America's endless production. Every day, the floating monsters grew stronger, faster, more numerous. On a humid evening in May 1942, as the sun set over the Coral Sea, a small group of American sailors stood on the flight deck of the Yorktown. They watched the horizon glow red and gold, the sea calm and deceptively peaceful. One of them turned to his friend and said quietly, "You think they know what's coming?" His friend laughed, adjusting his cap against the wind. "They called our ships monsters," he said. "Maybe they're right." The moment hung in the air, a mix of humor and foreboding, the calm before the storm. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Japanese fleets were moving toward Midway Island, ready to spring their trap. What they did not know was that the ocean itself had shifted sides. The monsters they feared were no myth. They were real, and soon, they would awaken. The sea, once Japan's proudest ally, was about to become its greatest enemy. Spring, 1942. The Pacific shimmered beneath an endless sky, deceptively calm, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. Far from any coastline, the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown carved white wakes through the water, their decks alive with motion. Men in grease-stained uniforms hauled cables, armed aircraft, and checked gauges in the heat. Above them, fighter squadrons roared into the clouds, disappearing into a horizon no man could predict. The air was thick with the smell of fuel and sweat. A new kind of battlefield was taking shape, one fought not by ships firing broadsides, but by aircraft that turned the sky into the sea's deadliest weapon. On the Enterprise, Admiral William Bull Halsey stood with his arms folded, wind whipping against his cap. He was a man carved from stubborn resolve, the embodiment of America's restless fury after Pearl Harbor. Around him, sailors whispered his name with both reverence and fear. Halsey understood something the old admirals did not. The ocean no longer belonged to the ships that floated on it, but to the planes that flew above it. Each carrier beneath his command was a fortress and a trap, a living thing that could strike across hundreds of miles. "They think they've seen monsters," he muttered to his aide, watching bombers lift from the deck. "Wait till they meet ours." In Tokyo, the mood was shifting. Japan had swept across the Pacific, capturing islands and humiliating Western powers, but the taste of triumph was already souring. The Doolittle raid in April had struck deep into the Japanese psyche. 16 American bombers, launched from the Hornet, had reached Tokyo itself. Though the material damage was minimal, the emotional shock was immense. The city that had seemed untouchable now trembled under foreign fire. For the first time, civilians whispered that perhaps the gods were not on Japan's side. The Imperial Navy, embarrassed and enraged, vowed vengeance. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto saw opportunity in the humiliation. He proposed a bold counterstroke, a trap designed to lure the American carriers into battle and destroy them in one decisive blow. The target, a small atoll in the middle of the Pacific, known as Midway. It was both strategically placed and symbolically perfect. Yamamoto believed the Americans would defend it at any cost. "If we crush their carriers there," he said in a meeting of the Naval General Staff, "the Pacific will belong to Japan." His officers nodded, though some hesitated. A few, like Admiral Tsuchinagumo, still believed in battleships as the heart of naval strength. Yet even he could not deny the new reality: the war's future was being fought from the sky. Meanwhile, aboard the Yorktown, Commander Mark Mitcher studied weather charts and radio intercepts late into the night. He had flown in the Navy's earliest experiments with carrier aircraft, when the decks were short and engines unreliable. Now, he watched as the U.S. fleet prepared to face the mightiest naval armada Japan had ever assembled. He felt both awe and dread. The Pacific, once a vast and indifferent wilderness, had become a killing ground. Every cloud could hide an enemy. Every shadow on the water could mean death. Yet he also felt something else, a quiet faith in the men who worked the flight decks, in their precision, their calm under pressure, their ability to make chaos into order. The carriers themselves seemed alive. Their engines throbbed like beating hearts. Their decks trembled as aircraft were catapulted into the wind. Below, thousands of men lived in cramped quarters, sharing stories, fears, and cigarettes. Many had never seen combat before. Some carried photographs of sweethearts taped inside their lockers, others played poker to drown out their nerves. "It's strange," one pilot wrote in his diary. "We fight a war against men we never see. We kill them from the clouds and they do the same to us. The ocean is just a stage. The real battle is in the air." By late May, Yamamoto's plan was in motion. 4 of Japan's most powerful carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, steamed toward Midway, escorted by cruisers and battleships. Their decks were filled with the same kind of aircraft that had once devastated Pearl Harbor. But now the balance had shifted. The Americans, thanks to codebreakers in Hawaii, knew the attack was coming. Every move of the Japanese fleet was being shadowed in silence. The trap, meant to annihilate the U.S. carriers, was about to turn on its creators. On June 4th, dawn broke over Midway with a pale orange glow. The first Japanese planes swept down on the atoll, their bombs shattering airstrips and fuel depots. The defenders fought back desperately, launching outdated fighters against overwhelming odds. At sea, the American carriers waited, hidden by distance and radio silence. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding in Halsey's absence, gave the order that would change the war: launch all aircraft. Within minutes, the decks erupted into motion, torpedo bombers rolling forward, dive bombers climbing into formation, fighters roaring off to guard them. The sky filled with the hum of determination. For hours, the two forces circled each other, blind in the immensity of the ocean. Japanese reconnaissance failed to locate the American fleet in time. When the carriers finally spotted each other, it was already too late. A formation of American dive bombers, low on fuel and nearly out of luck, found the Japanese carriers as their decks were loaded with refueling planes and bombs. The scene that followed was pure chaos. From 20,000 feet, bombs screamed downward like falling stars. Within seconds, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were engulfed in fire. Pilots trapped in cockpits burned alive as aviation fuel spread across the decks. Survivors dove into the oily sea, their ships exploding behind them. A Japanese officer later described the sight as the death of a nation's pride. The Hiryu fought back, launching a desperate counterattack that damaged the Yorktown, but it too was soon destroyed. In a single morning, Japan had lost 4 of its finest carriers and more than 300 of its best pilots. The ocean that had carried its empire to glory now swallowed it whole. On the Enterprise, the mood was somber, not triumphant. Men cheered, yes, but many also stood in silence, watching the smoke on the horizon. They had witnessed something far larger than victory. It was the moment the balance of the Pacific had changed forever. Commander Mitchell walked the deck that night, the air still heavy with the smell of burned oil, and thought of Yamamoto, the man who had once warned that Japan could only win for 6 months before American strength crushed them. Exactly 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor. The prophecy had come true. Back in Tokyo, Yamamoto received the news with his usual composure. He bowed his head and said only, "So, the gods have left us." He knew the loss could never be replaced. Japan's shipyards could not build new carriers fast enough, nor train new pilots in time. America's production, by contrast, was already accelerating beyond imagination. The Essex-class carriers were rolling off assembly lines like clockwork, floating monsters, born from steel and industry. And yet, even in defeat, Yamamoto refused despair. "We will fight to the end," he said to his staff. "If monsters rule the sea, then we must become ghosts." His words carried a strange, weary pride. The age of battleships was over. The ocean now belonged to those who commanded the sky. As the flames of Midway dimmed behind the setting sun, the Pacific was transformed. The carriers had proven what no admiral had dared believe, that the future of warfare floated not in armor or guns, but in wings and willpower. The monsters Japan had mocked now ruled the ocean, and they were only beginning to awaken. October 1944. The Pacific was no longer Japan's empire, it was its graveyard. What had once been a vast ocean of conquest now seethed with American carrier groups that stretched from horizon to horizon, their decks crawling with planes, their hulls bristling with steel. The war that began with thunder at Pearl Harbor had come full circle. Japan's once invincible fleet had been shattered at Midway, broken at the Philippine Sea, and now, at Leyte Gulf, it faced annihilation. Yet even as their empire crumbled, Japan's sailors and pilots still spoke in hushed tones about the enemy that haunted them, the floating monsters. The name was no longer an insult. It was a fearful kind of respect, whispered as if the ocean itself might hear. Aboard the American carrier St. Lo, Ensign Harold Johnson rubbed grease from his hands and stared out at the gray expanse of the Philippine Sea. He was 21, a mechanic from Ohio, and he'd been at sea for nearly 2 years. The deck beneath him trembled constantly, the heartbeat of engines that never slept. Around him, crews loaded bombs, refueled planes, and laughed at jokes that didn't matter. Every man on board knew that once the order came, laughter would vanish, replaced by the cold rhythm of combat. Johnson had stopped thinking about home months ago. The war had become his entire horizon. Across the sea, aboard the carrier Zuikaku, Captain Takeo Shiga watched his crew move with grim precision. The Zuikaku was one of the last survivors of Pearl Harbor, the ship that had once helped cripple the American fleet. Now, its decks were filled with boys barely old enough to shave, their flight hours measured in weeks, not months. Shiga's veterans were gone, buried beneath the waters of Midway and the Marianas. He knew his fleet was sailing toward destruction, yet he could not turn away. Honor demanded he fight. The Emperor's broadcast had been clear: the Empire's fate depends upon the outcome of this battle. For Shiga, that meant one thing: his life and the lives of his crew were already offered. When dawn broke over Leyte Gulf on October 25th, the sea erupted. Japan launched what remained of its carrier force not as a weapon, but as a decoy. The Zuikaku, the Zuho, and a handful of smaller carriers were sent north to draw the American fleet away from the real strike group, battleships and cruisers meant to destroy the U.S. invasion force landing in the Philippines. But the Americans had changed. Where once they had chased pride and single victories, now they hunted with discipline and coordination. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding the massive Task Force 38, saw the Japanese bait for what it was, and still he struck. From the decks of over a dozen carriers, hundreds of planes screamed into the sky. Bombers climbed in layered formations, their wings glinting like silver knives. Radio chatter filled the air: codes, bearings, laughter, fear. As they neared the Japanese decoy fleet, the ocean below bloomed with explosions. Dive bombers fell from the clouds like hawks. The first bombs tore open the Zuikaku's flight deck, sending shards of metal flying like shrapnel from a volcano. Fires raged, pilots scrambled, and ammunition cooked off in fiery bursts. Shiga watched as his ship began to list, smoke curling around the rising sun painted on her hull. He gave the order to abandon ship. When the Zuikaku rolled beneath the waves, her crew saluted her with tears streaming down their faces. The last of the Pearl Harbor carriers was gone. Far to the south, the true battle was unfolding near Samar Island. There, a small group of American escort carriers, tiny compared to their Essex-class giants, faced the largest surface fleet Japan had left. Battleships like the Yamato, armed with guns that could fire shells weighing more than a car, closed in. The American ships were defenseless. They weren't even supposed to fight. Their role was to ferry planes and support troops. Yet in one of the war's strangest twists, these little baby flat tops became the stuff of legend. The St. Lo, the Gambier Bay, and their companions turned toward the enemy, launching every aircraft they could. Pilots, low on fuel and armed with machine guns meant for ground attacks, dove straight at the oncoming behemoths. Harold Johnson watched the sky turn red with tracer fire. When a Japanese shell slammed into the water beside the St. Lo, he was thrown to the deck. The ship shuddered, alarms wailed, and men shouted through smoke. "Incoming! Kamikaze!" someone yelled. It was a word few Americans had heard before. Out of the clouds came a lone Japanese plane, its nose already aflame. It didn't turn away. It didn't pull up. It slammed into the St. Lo's deck with the force of a meteor, detonating bombs and fuel in a chain reaction that split the ship apart. Johnson barely had time to run before the world became a blur of fire and wind. When he surfaced, gasping, he saw the St. Lo disappearing beneath the waves, the first carrier sunk by a suicide attack. From that day on, the kamikaze became Japan's final weapon. To the Americans, it was madness. To the Japanese, it was sacrifice. Thousands of young men volunteered to turn themselves into human bombs, believing that honor demanded it. Captain Shiga, rescued from the sinking Zuikaku, watched as his remaining pilots bowed before taking off, their faces serene. "We are the petals of the cherry blossom," one said softly. "We fall, but our beauty remains." Shiga had no answer. He envied their certainty, even as he pitied them. For the men on the American carriers, the kamikaze brought a new kind of terror. Unlike bombers or torpedo planes, these attackers didn't retreat. They came straight through fire, trailing smoke, wings shaking apart, eyes fixed on the deck. The sky over the Philippines turned into a storm of steel. Pilots in Wildcats and Hellcats fought to intercept the suiciders before they hit. Gunners on deck fired until their barrels glowed red. Still some got through. The Franklin, the Bunker Hill, the Ticonderoga, all were struck. And yet, none of it stopped the fleet. Like a machine of flesh and metal, it absorbed the blows and kept moving. Admiral Halsey, reading reports from the battle, said quietly, "They think we can be scared into retreat. They don't understand, we don't stop." His words were less bravado than truth. The American carriers had become floating cities, each with thousands of men, doctors, mechanics, cooks, and chaplains. When one deck burned, another launched planes. When one ship sank, 3 more arrived to replace it. To the Japanese, it seemed impossible, almost supernatural. "The monsters cannot be killed," a Japanese officer wrote after late. "We destroy one, and 3 more rise. The ocean itself fights for them." In the months that followed, the Pacific turned into a furnace. Carrier-based bombers reduced island after island to ash. Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The names blurred into one endless battle. Japan's remaining pilots were teenagers, their training shortened to weeks. They took off knowing they would not return. American carrier crews grew hardened, mechanical, almost numb. The camaraderie that once lightened their days gave way to exhaustion. "We fly, we land, we fight again," one pilot wrote in his logbook. "No one talks about fear anymore. We're past it." By the spring of 1945, Japan's navy was a ghost. Only one symbol of its old power remained: the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built. When American intelligence learned she was heading for Okinawa, the response was merciless. More than 400 planes from multiple carrier groups descended upon her in waves. Bombs tore her open, torpedoes snapped her spine, and within hours, the pride of the Imperial Navy was gone, swallowed by fire and sea. From the air, one American pilot described the sight as a mountain sinking. For Japan, it was the final confirmation. The era of battleships, of samurai seas, had ended. In Tokyo, Admiral Toyota, Yamamoto's successor, received the report of Yamato's loss and stood silently by his desk. His staff expected anger, but he only whispered, "So ends our dream." He understood what the Americans had become. They were no longer simply enemies. Their carriers, vast and tireless, embodied an industrial spirit Japan could not match. "The ocean belongs to them now," he said. "Even the gods would fear them." For men like Harold Johnson, the war's end felt both inevitable and surreal. The sea that had been his prison for years now carried him closer to victory, but victory felt hollow. He had seen too many die, too many ships vanish. One evening, as he stood alone on the deck of the Enterprise, he watched the sunset bleed into the sea. The horizon was littered with other carriers, their silhouettes immense against the dying light. He thought of the name the Japanese had given them, floating monsters, and found it strangely fitting. They were not just ships, they were creatures of war, born from metal and willpower, unstoppable and unfeeling. The war was not yet over, but everyone could sense the end. Japan was burning. Its cities, its ships, its spirit, consumed by the very monsters it had once mocked. The ocean, once a stage for honor, had become an arena for survival. As night fell, Johnson looked up at the stars, their reflections flickering in the waves. The world felt vast and empty, yet alive with memory. Somewhere out there, in the ruins of the Pacific, the ghosts of sailors, Japanese and American alike, drifted together beneath the same moonlight, silent witnesses to the age when the sea belonged to monsters. August 1945. The Pacific lay quiet in a way it hadn't for years. The rumble of engines, the roar of bombers, the cries of dying men, all had faded into an eerie calm. Smoke still rose from the ruins of Okinawa, and the American fleets that had once moved like thunderheads across the ocean now drifted at anchor, waiting. On board the USS Enterprise, Ensign Harold Johnson leaned against the rail, staring at the distant horizon. The sun was setting blood red, painting the water with streaks of fire. He should have felt relief. The war was ending. Instead, he felt hollow, as if the sea had swallowed something inside him. Every man on board sensed that history was about to shift, though none could say how. The rumors came first as whispers. America had a new weapon, something beyond imagination. Some said it was a bomb that could destroy an entire city. Others laughed it off as propaganda. Johnson didn't know what to believe until August 6, when the news reached them by radio: Hiroshima, gone. Not damaged, not bombed, gone. A single explosion had erased an entire city. Men gathered around the radio, silent, listening to reports that sounded like fiction. One officer muttered, "We've become gods." Another said softly, "No, devils." 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. By then, the Japanese Empire had already collapsed in everything but name. Its cities were ash, its fleet rusting beneath the waves, its skies ruled by American planes. Yet even as Emperor Hirohito's voice echoed across Japan, surrendering for the first time in history, not all men accepted it. Some clung to the belief that death was preferable to defeat. Among them was Captain Takeo Shiga, the same man who had watched his carrier, the Zuikaku, sink at Leyte Gulf. Rescued and reassigned to a coastal defense unit near Kyushu, he had lived with the unbearable weight of survival. Now, with surrender ordered, he faced a torment deeper than any battle. Shiga stood in the ruins of his base as the Emperor's broadcast ended. Around him, young officers wept openly, their tears cutting clean streaks through faces streaked with soot and oil. The air smelled of burning paper, the smoke of documents they'd been ordered to destroy. "It is over," one lieutenant whispered. "We have lost everything." Shiga looked out toward the sea, where the silhouettes of American ships already loomed on the horizon. He said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "No, we still have our honor. And I intend to meet them as a soldier, not a ghost." As occupation forces prepared to land, the Enterprise was reassigned to Japan's coast. Johnson found himself staring through binoculars at the land they had fought for years to reach. Cities lay in ruins, bridges shattered, docks half-sunk. What surprised him most was not the destruction, it was the silence. No gunfire, no cheering, no life. Just the quiet aftermath of total victory. The crew was ordered to prepare a landing party to assist with humanitarian operations, searching for survivors, distributing supplies, establishing order. For Johnson, it felt surreal. He had spent years helping to destroy this country. Now he would walk its soil to help it rise again. When the Enterprise's launch touched the blackened shore, the air was heavy with ash and salt. Johnson stepped onto the dock and felt his boots sink into mud mixed with soot. The port was deserted except for a few civilians who watched from the shadows, their faces thin and wary. He handed out cans of food, water, blankets, unsure what to say. An old woman bowed deeply, whispering words he didn't understand. Her hands trembled as she accepted the ration tin. Johnson nodded, but something in his chest ached. He had imagined this moment for years, the end of the war, but he had never imagined guilt. Inland, Captain Shiga gathered what remained of his men. He had no illusions about the hopelessness of their situation. Yet he refused to raise a white flag. "The Emperor may surrender," he told them quietly, "but our duty does not end with words." There were 15 of them left, officers, mechanics, even a few pilots who had survived by chance. They listened to him in silence, torn between loyalty and despair. One of them, Lieutenant Hayashi, barely 20, spoke up. "Sir, what are we fighting for now? There's nothing left to defend." Shiga met his gaze. "Then we fight for memory, so that the world knows Japan did not kneel easily." That night, Shiga led his men into the hills overlooking the coast. They watched as American ships lit the dark sea like floating cities. From the cliffs, their silhouettes resembled monsters again, immense, unblinking, immortal. Shiga felt a strange calm watching them. The fear that had haunted him for years was gone. He had seen death too many times to be afraid of it now. "We will strike once more," he said quietly. "Not for victory. For meaning." At dawn, the Americans came ashore again, unarmed this time, carrying crates of medical supplies. Johnson walked at the front of the column, scanning the hills through rising mist. The air smelled of rain. He didn't expect an ambush, the war was over. But war had taught him to trust silence even less than gunfire. When the first shot cracked through the air, it echoed like the past refusing to die. A bullet tore into the sand near his feet. Instinct took over. "Down," he shouted, diving for cover. More shots followed, coming from the ridgeline above. The Marines returned fire, their shouts breaking the fragile peace. Shiga's men fired from behind rocks, their rifles old and rusted, their aim desperate. He knew they couldn't hold out. Still, he kept firing, methodical, precise. Below, the Americans moved with terrifying coordination, advancing under covering fire. It was over in minutes. Smoke drifted through the trees, the hillsides silent once more. Shiga stood alone, bleeding from a wound in his shoulder, his men lying motionless around him. He looked down at the shore, at the Americans tending their wounded, at the chaos he had caused for nothing. Slowly he lowered his weapon. Johnson climbed the slope cautiously, gun raised. When he reached the top, he found Shiga standing beside a dead tree, his uniform torn, blood darkening his sleeve. Their eyes met, two soldiers who had fought the same war from opposite ends of the ocean. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind carried the faint sound of waves below. Then Shiga, his English broken but steady, said, "The war should have ended with honor. Not like this." Johnson lowered his rifle. "It ended the only way it could," he replied. "We both lost too much to call it victory." Shiga smiled faintly, then sank to his knees. His gaze drifted toward the sea. "Your ships," he murmured, "they never stop. Even now. You have become the ocean itself." Johnson didn't know how to answer. He watched as Shiga's breathing slowed, his eyes still fixed on the horizon, where the Enterprise floated like a ghost. For the first time in years, Johnson felt the full weight of what that ship meant. Not power, not glory, but endurance. It was the symbol of everything relentless and terrible about war. When Johnson returned to the beach, the sun had broken through the clouds. The air shimmered with heat, and for the first time since the kamikaze attacks, he heard laughter, soft, cautious, human. Sailors passed out rations to children who smiled shyly in return. Somewhere, a phonograph played a scratchy tune from home. The world, impossibly, was beginning to live again. But Johnson couldn't shake the image of Shiga's eyes, the resignation, the strange peace. He realized then that wars didn't end with treaties or broadcasts. They ended when men like Shiga stopped fighting inside themselves. Weeks later, the Enterprise sailed into Tokyo Bay, joining the armada gathered for Japan's official surrender. Johnson stood on deck as the USS Missouri received Japan's delegation. The sky was perfectly clear, the sea calm. Around him, thousands of sailors stood in silence as General MacArthur read the words that ended the bloodiest war in history. For Johnson, the sound of pens scratching across paper was louder than any bomb. It was the sound of ghosts being released. As the fleet prepared to depart, Johnson looked out over the city. Smoke still curled from the ruins, but beyond it, cranes were already rising, rebuilding. The war that had forged monsters would now give birth to something new. He thought of Shiga, of the pilots who had fallen like cherry blossoms, of the carriers that had burned and sunk. All of it had led to this quiet moment, a horizon where the world might finally begin again. When night fell, the ocean reflected the lights of 1,000 ships. Johnson leaned against the railing one last time, the wind cold and clean on his face. The Enterprise hummed beneath his feet, alive, unbroken, eternal. Somewhere below deck, a mechanic tuned an old radio, and faint music drifted through the corridors, a song about coming home. Johnson closed his eyes and listened. The sea that had devoured everything now whispered softly, almost tenderly. It no longer belonged to monsters. It belonged to memory. And as the great carrier turned toward the open Pacific, her wake glowed silver in the moonlight, a path through the ruins of war, leading not to battle, but to peace. My respective brothers and sisters, if you like the story, please subscribe our channel and like the video and comment us a topic which you like. I will upload next video on this topic which you comment. Stay blessed, take care.